I'm today going to explore kind of the beginnings of the projects that I've been kind of questioning design through, in particular a few years ago while working on a book project. And so that for me starts with this sort of underlying idea of what stories are underpinning design. So what are the methods that then might be possible if we as designers were to tell those stories differently? So this sort of interlocking focus on how we replay what we do and tell and communicate that and the things that we build and their impacts on the world. So for much of my training, these questions were kind of present and part of the research in sort of design and computer science, HCI, through very widely celebrated scholars and ideas conceptualized by John Dewey, Herbert Simon, Donald Shern, people who had so much to offer a design field in terms of the kinds of collaborations and work to undo a very extractive relationship with environment and space, but also who had limited things to say about the more hegemonic and patriarchal legacies of the field. So one thing that has been stunning and exciting to see is the range of texts that I find inspiring on the daily basis have come out in the last few years that really challenge some of those kinds of more limited perspectives on what design is and who it impacts and why. So in particular, scholars that are thinking about the kinds of grossly uneven forms of representation of contributions to computing regimes, and are chronicling this through a sense for what futures are possible when we account for our past. Right? A few people have been particularly notable in my thinking in this space. In particular, historian Saidiya Hartman's work in terms of the kinds of ways she has coined the phrase critical fabulation, in which the book described, Michael just mentioned, came about, who speaks about the writing against an archive, right? So an archive is a collection of documents that represents a history, a particular point of view. But from her vivid essay, Venus into Acts, she describes what it means to narrate the impossible. So that is a kind of story from the example of an enslaved woman, Venus, that has no known or knowable story. That kind of gap in the archive means for her representing a sequence of events. It calls for attempting to jeopardize the status of the event, displacing a received or authorized account, and imagining what might have happened, what might have said, or what might have been done. More recently, just this last few months, you might have seen a really powerful text by Catherine McKittrick came out through a sort of encounter between cultural geography and Black studies that she has spent time thinking through, Sylvia Winter's work and Hartman as well as others, in exploring the role of storytelling in a kind of complementary sense, where stories are not answers. She says stories offer an aesthetic relationality that relies on dynamics of creating, narrating, listening, hearing, reading, sometimes unhearing. So this is really about also challenging this engagement with a kind of a kind of radical engagement that involves care and connection over a kind of exclusion-inclusion politics. So a very different relation between those that are involved in the work of producing science and engineering. And this may seem far from the HCI space, but today I'm going to try and tie it in with two projects, two specific engineering feats. So something that we might celebrate as innovations within design legacies, so Apollo and Atari. And specifically thinking about how we can take inspiration from these stories through design. And what I want to explore here are two phases of this process. So one is looking what it's like to expose the kind of erasures in our stories, and then the other focusing on what kinds of design processes affect and shape the world in which those stories are told, so the retelling. So the first story begins with a kind of short, few seconds clip of a documentary mini-series that came out in 2008. And here you see this picture of two people who appear to be women with rolled up sleeves in a kind of factory setting, who are passing a kind of needle back and forth through a grid of holes. So and to me, and maybe to some of you, this process actually resembled something like weaving. So there was a lacing of threads in orthogonal directions, creating a kind of textile fabric. But here in this setting, you see that the weavers are using unconventional materials such as magnetic rings, wire, and odd-shaped loom. And they appear to be in a very unusual space for what you might think of as textile creations, in the sense of the machinery surrounding them. Now, over the scene, you see the voice of a managing director at the factory. This is Richard Batten, who says clearly, "We called this process the LOL method," says, "the little old lady method of wiring cores." So essentially, this footage, which I came across during PhD studies studying the intersection of fabric and computing, I was interested in how this few seconds long clip became actually one of the only surviving accounts of the women who physically wove the software for the Apollo missions during the 1960s. So this is a process of creating what was called core memory. During the 50s and 60s, this was a principal mechanism by which computers were storing and retrieving information. So it was a physical distinction that was created where, pictured here, you see core memory rope. Passing the wire through the rope creates the one, while bypassing it creates the zero. And that design of core memory came at a time where the computing industry looked radically different, right? We have these massive machines, heavy, running on punch cards, sort of filling up a room that dominated the industry. Now, contrasting with those room-sized space mechanics, you see the need for essentially a cone, a rocket, some kind of code that needed to fit inside that cone of that rocket. So it's a very particular setup, right, where you have extreme temperatures, extreme vibrations, limited electricity, and essentially every part of the weaving of these cores met these constraints. So when we hear the story of this feat of Apollo, the first mission to the moon and back with people on board, these stories of Apollo vis-a-vis people like Neil Armstrong are not telling the stories of this particular process, right? What we hear about the process are told by the people that are managing directors, like Richard Batten. So to explore this vis-a-vis design, the process began exploding in front of us. I began working with Samantha Shorey, a communication scholar, as well as Helen Remick and Brock Kraft, and wider group of folks interested in this development of computing and stories about that process. So we began looking through the archives at different formations of core memory as they developed into what's called core memory planes, and formed informing the design of eventual core memory rope, but also involving even smaller weaving instruments and microscopes. And while collecting the initial materials, came across a small number of planes online and ordered them and held them in our hands. And this was the moment of connection. So in our hands, those planes actually felt a kind of sort of a symmetry with the shape size of an oddly complementary mode of memory production. And that memory production was that of quilting. So over the coming months, we collaboratively built a quilt made up of the core memory planes, those patches that would materialize that work of the core memory weavers, as well as pose new points of encounter. So we worked in development across a series of patents, across electronic textiles, materials, old telephone wire that was repurposed as forms of quilting process, and thinking about how this feminized legacies of practice could be casted, reworked and undone through this hardware manufacturing process. So then during a series of workshops, we took a kind of approach at opening the quilt itself and invited groups of historians of technology, design educators and members of the public who were visiting maker fairs and such, were interested in the assembling of what we eventually called patch kits. So these kits were comprised in the board, loom, and strings in place of the cores and wires, and each became a kind of future quilt square. So once assembled, those patches acted as tools to explore an archive of media materials, firsthand accounts of core memory production that we collected along the way. So you would plug in the assembled patch into the quilt and hear aloud oral accounts of core memory production from our archive materials. But then you'd also be tweeting those materials from the Twitter account LOL Weavers, which was a sort of attempt to reflect the same number of characters that were once held by each core memory plane, but also to matriculate these stories of wider audiences. So for example, one of the quotes read, "The female operators were good at it, and those that stood around telling them what to do were terrible at it." It's from Edwin Blodden. So soon that conversation turned to the language that we use to describe the process of making core memory and how that process compared to the engineers themselves. So when asked what that kind of mode that I called weaving earlier was assigned within core memory literatures and the folks that were managing, I turned to a man named Frederick Dill, who I'd been in touch with and had been an engineer and co-inventor of the semiconductor laser, and had sent me a beautiful typed and written note along with the book, Digital Computer Components and Circuits. And his note read, "Until the discussion, I'd never heard of stringing cores as a weaving problem, but it's certainly a good view." Now, to understand what he meant by this, I followed up an email and he told me, well, when I was at what you have done is focus on the threads, the wires, where I focused on the cores. I looked at the wires through the cores in terms of what electrical signals they provided, what voltages appeared at their ends, and from various electrical currents through the single core array of cores. I could see how the wires were passed through the cores, and your focus on weaving is an equally valid viewpoint, but a different one. It sort of assumes that some particular configuration of weaving will produce what is needed, which is totally correct. So in paying attention to weaving alongside the electrical cores themselves, we were seeing these layers of production and unable to explore and highlight the laboring of bodies alongside the things that they were producing. So in highlighting those different stories of embodied practice, we're also identifying the weave as that pivotal innovation, which Dill said was what produced what was needed. So this insight is highly unusual because it is fully admitted from the core memory literature, but also it recognizes embodied practice or bodies at all as part of the contribution, the key contributions to engineering. And this is something that our collaborator, Helen Remick, picked up in the quilting of the object itself, in which she said quilting isn't just handwork, it's back work, it's neck work, it's knee work. And the process of building Apollo was all those things as well. So now exploring this kind of sort of exposure of erasures and exploring it in a material fashion was a kind of a lead into a second project that was led by Pernilla Bjorn in a class that we co-taught on the study of Atari. And I'm going to walk through how that particular classroom experience, which we call the kind of directed research group, was able to produce a series of interesting encounters with the Atari legacy. So in this very different context, the team included a number of students that were taking this course with us, and this series of events that were scaffolded after the course. So these included Emerald City Comic-Con, a full exhibition at the Living Computer Museum in Seattle, and a fashion show in the heart of Seattle's Pioneer Square. So where we started was actually with this particular notion of design in recognition within the Atari legacy. If you remember Atari, it was a gaming console that was instrumental in the early arcade video computer gaming industries. It was a corporation that produced the gaming console, I should say, that was formed in 1972. And then it lasted well into the 80s. So the kind of company stories that get told are pretty exciting on the one hand, stories of Pong, these early games that animated many of those of us that have been drawn into computing fields, but they also tended to leave out several stories or to depict them in very limited fashion. So when we began sort of exploring the Wikipedia documents and archival materials, primary and secondary on Atari, it was clear that people that present as women are excluded from many of those stories. When they do appear, they are often depicted with very limited explanations. So for example, a few texts mentioned Don Epstein or Beth Tycho by name. These are particular Atari contributors, but there was no mention of their contributions. These are the erasures then that inspired our project. So across a series of months, as I explained, we developed exhibitions and particular design artifacts that were then part of the events, the panels, and the other engagements that we created. The first of these was a simple reworking of the brand itself. So an initial intervention took that Atari A logo and fused it with the image of a silhouette of a sort of upward looking to the right empowerment. For a second sort of a complementary story, we explored each of the interviewees that Pernilla engaged with through a kind of visual mark. So we created simplified low resolution images that represented each character and each character or antagonist in the game that was produced vis-a-vis the Atari movement. Those then sort of provided the groundwork for a larger poster that was celebrating their particular story, as the Centipede, for example, which Donna Bailey was responsible for developing with a team in the early coin-op consoles, Prismatic. Rebecca Heinemann is a Space Invader graphic, etc., where she was the first esports game champion for that particular Pac-Man. So organizing this around more material forms, we took those graphics, which were produced as posters and other paraphernalia, brochures, into a kind of gaming genre of the token, which is the kind of coins used in early arcade games, so reflecting that legacy and intertextual relation. So those were concrete artifacts that could serve as kind of collectibles in our encounters. A fourth of specific piece was this organized sort of e-textile intervention, where our efforts to connect with Comic-Con, which is a very kind of cosplay-centric conference. Cosplay refers to a performance art where people create costumes, dress up with their favorite characters, and often characters from games, movies, comics, and then sort of celebrate that sort of gaming culture. So in this costume, the Atari logo was wired up with multicolored LED strips and created these blinky rainbows. So this is really about engaging the students themselves and how they represent their interests in the stories that Prunella had recorded through these oral history accounts. Now, the kind of follow-up to this is actually in the surprising moments that sort of an encounter through the interview enabled. So, for example, Suki Lee, who worked at Apple, had brought up in the interview her colleague who was actually posting of his discovery on social media, writing, "I bought a bunch of Atari games today, but while I was reading up on them, I found one of them was written by my team's current EPM. It's like I've been working next to royalty without even knowing it." So these experiences of sort of encountering the people in your environment in Silicon Valley and Stanford, very true, very common, who are in fact part of the sort of groundwork of technology culture. And that experience was one that inspired, in this case, Jim Turner to have Suki Lee sign one of the games and frame it, and then have a series of artifacts that sort of appeared in similar fashion, 3D printed frames in the Seattle Technology Museum. Our final design artifact came out from just a simple remix of the Pac-Man game itself, wherein the students designed each of the Pac-Man elements with the story of Donna Bailey in mind. Donna Bailey is, again, involved in the Centipede's development and her story was not only recorded in interview Purnell, but also recorded in a kind of a screenplay of sorts that she wrote out about a sort of almost autobiographical time in her life. So here we used what were at once the cutscenes where Miss Pac-Man married Pac-Man, instead replacing that with her script. So she describes, for example, she recorded for this game the text, "On my first day at work, I was introduced to more than 50 guys. Are they all Dave? I'll just call everyone Dave." So looking across these projects, what design starts to do in this context is to be understood through the very process of writing history or historiography. So this is about seeing how we as HCI researchers can sort of work with the hidden elements of the novel creations that we tend to ascribe to our own work in the field, and who is not credited, but also how those non-credited elements can inform the design of new spaces and practices. So it's really about a reading of the work that sort of cuts across two dimensions. So on the one hand, we have the ability to garner significant institutional support, publicity, by thinking about important stories that have, sort of escaped the attention of Apollo or a gaming enthusiast, and bringing that back to the folks in design that care most about the representation of our field. On the other hand, there are these experiences of reading that are actually full of potentials for objectification. So, for example, the feminization of an engineering context through metaphors of craft work or a binary category of women. And we turn this kind of complex and written story of under-recognized labor into a series of objects, so much figuratively and literally sort of reifying these exclusions. Now, with these two stories, you can see that power of metaphor. So we are using metaphor here for shaping what designers attend to, but also what they hide. And this is the fraught nature of this kind of analysis of historical approach to design, in the sense that this is drawing our attention to stakes in a way that creates conditions for reckoning. In reckoning, I want to draw attention to this idea that erasure is something to be constantly attended to and revisited. And what we mean by erasure is actually something very, very specifically in contrast to a filling of gaps. So when you speak about erasure as refusing that reification, what we mean is that gaps exist as a thing in the world, but erasure is refusing to see it as stable or as persistent. So it holds on to action. It works as a verb. Erasure also resists naturalizing a disappearance. So where a gap can be organic, a kind of silence of sorts, and erasure is a result of an intervention. Erasure is also implicating its maker, so us designers or technologists, where a gap ignores agency in that way. Erasure is recognizing not just that act of doing, right? It's permitting naming the responsible subject. Erasure is also eschewing the sense of closure or renewal. So where a gap appears cleanly with sort of a fill or filling the gap, an erasure just does not imply that clean ending or solution. And lastly, erasure makes possible the nonlinear. So where we conceptualize time and progress as something that is much more complex and collective in form, where a gap allows for filling a sequence, and erasure kind of confounds that telling, linear telling. So if you recall Donna Bailey's film script playing back over the Atari Women Pac-Man game, for those audiences, the experience of coworkers appearing as all Daves are hovering over that moment, and tension. Look, this moment of putative empowerment is actually, it's unsettling, this division between Ben and Bell. And we are doing this constantly ongoingly in our work of development. With the with the core memory project, we saw this happening in the context of the retellings of MIT Museum's footage, the Apollo guidance computer, where an interviewing journalist observing the woman as she doesn't have to think about which chord goes through next, but Jack Poundstone responds as a managing Raytheon director here. The machine does that for her, right? No. So this idea of the women as unthinking executors as code rather than inventive contributors is reverberating throughout these public narratives of the Apollo mission. But once you engage with the sort of praxis of creating the story once again in the present, it becomes much harder for us to feel this and hold on to those perceptions. So understanding an encounter with historical inquiry as vital to our experiences in design means not keeping these two methods as separate and unique archival sort of encounters being vital to the work we do within any context of design. And it's sort of taking this lesson to many of the sort of design methods we take up in the D-School context, this classic hexagon narrative. Whether you see it as a cycle or as a path, you're still forced in encounters with our sort of legacies of exclusion, and that are enshrined in design classrooms and institutions, to take seriously the way these processes are actually embedded in structural inequities and reproducing them along the way. A process that ends very much with one of erasure. So for the projects that I've shown you so far, sort of the most easily describable method might be that of speculative design. These are not creating projects or products that can be taken up in sort of everyday life. They're actually encounters, right, and modes of questioning. And speculative design has been a mode of doing that work. And speculative diagrams are often seen in this way as Tony Dunn, Fiona Raby's diagram, Stuart Candy's work, where you see a present, right, a one perspective dot, and that dot looks out to the future of possible, plausible, or probable, preferable being the sort of most interesting red projection out there. And that preferable is typically sort of placed without questioning who decides on what preferences are. Now, Ebru Kerbak, a textile artist, has thought through the ways in which this possibilities cone might be reversed, and in which we might be asking questions that also include the influence of the past, right? And the way that these openings, analytic openings, could come from a process of looking backward. But what we see throughout these projects today is the ways in which whether a workshop or a classroom experience can actually produce multiple perspectives at once. So we're not seeing from one place, but we're seeing from a couple of moments of silence, in a sense, where we see those ghostly traces speaking in the present, and that disrupts the timeline of design. So we're essentially always innovating by maintaining the status quo, and thus needing to intervene in those trajectories at every turn. Now, I want to say this in the context of current debates in which erasures are affecting our departments, our institutions, in very real ways. And in particular, thinking about how our kind of sort of organizations of design work can allow for shaping our highest awards and accolades, including the Turing Award, as many of you have weighed in on and explored, and folks that have graduated from your program have noted that this week, the sort of communities we build, the collective lives that we hold up as part of our computing legacy, are tied up in harmful forms of exclusion, and in fact, these things are reified in the design of awards themselves. So again, approaching these through a more collective lens means also exploring what other ways we can tell new and different stories. And I want to end with a kind of hope that you consider the standpoints you bring to your field and the kind of ideas for creating different conditions for accountabilities across your work to be included in the kinds of publications that we might build together as a editor-in-chief of Interactions magazine, we've been looking specifically at different tactics, mobilities, and connections, and how we might build the conditions for what Saidiya Hartman would call an impossible story. So with that, I would love to take your questions and talk through any of the ideas you have for building that world together.
So we have a question asking, how do you balance the rediscovery of history versus the rewriting of history?
Yeah, so many, this is sort of the long debate amongst historians of science, but also historians writ large, right? It's the idea that history is not a thing in the world that you find, but it's actively always made. And historiography is a term for particularly recognizing that when we talk about history, we're actually also talking about its representation, its telling, and its writing, and that it's an active process of production. So I wouldn't say that there's a difference between those in the sense that, yes, of course, facts are real and things that I'm not trying to sort of elevate a misinformation agenda. What I am saying, though, is that even the events that happen in the world can be told in multiple ways, right? And yes, rewriting is part actually of an active reversing of power hierarchies or inverting or challenging of particular knowledge knowledge hierarchies within fields of computing and wider discussions across science and technology fields.
A lot of organizations, SIGCHI, folks like that, try to be inclusive by people and making sure that the awards committees and the conference committees and so forth include women, include people from, all over the world and that sort of thing. But that seems to make the smoothest path be something that's kind of similar to what we have now with more voice there, but it doesn't change things as fundamentally as some of your projects have just, done a complete rewrite on your, mental model of everything. Can you comment a little about how people trying to do the thing can be truly inclusive rather than just like having more people in the room, but the room is the same?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, there's so many, it's a great question. So first off, I would say, yes, there's an allocation of resources, and it's super important to just be clear that there needs to be different people who, have access to those resources, right? And that's just a fact. But how to do that, and how to do that in a way that matters and is sustainable, et cetera, that's part of the question. So I think, on a conceptual level, I think the whole politics of inclusion, Sarah Ahmed makes this point nicely, is tied up in the idea that there's an includer and an included, right? And so there's already a power differential between those that are making the choice as to who gets to be in and who gets to be out, and those people that are sort of moved this way and that way. And of course, this is not deterministic. The people that are included all have agency and to reverse those tides and to undo and challenge those dynamics. But just the politics of inclusion tends to work ultimately through that conceptual lens, right? If there's the folks that are organizing the awards, and they might include someone in there, and they just make those choices. So how do you undo that? And I think that's kind of one of the critical pieces of any of this work is that we need to sort of decenter the designer, or decenter that power figure, or the kind of figure of the includer, and ultimately understand that those folks making decisions need to be representative of the people that they are affecting. And does that mean more elections? Probably, right? More people being able to vote and choose who are those representatives within SIGCHI, within ACM. The elections themselves need to be well organized. I know there's been a lot of hiccups this year, for example, just sort of even registering to be a part of that conversation and have a voice. I'm essentially advocating for more processes that support democratic exchange. I don't know if that answers your question, though. Do you have a sort of a follow-up?
Not really. It's just something that puzzles me. I suppose as some of the traditionally excluded people become central, the main power figures, but we've had women as president of ACM and chair of SIGCHI. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, we have. Did that change anything? I don't know. Yeah, certainly not in humongous ways. Things have been, getting more diverse, and there's been more diverse people included. But it seems like it's real easy to just kind of slip into the old ways of doing things and the old set of people. If you're not careful, you'll, the first dozen people that you nominate tend to be white men.
Yeah, I mean, I think the critical point is that the folks that are probably able to do the most to change these institutional arrangements are actually the same people that those institutions forcibly disallow from having any control over the process. So whoever makes their way into the role of president is typically someone who has very much been a part of that institutional politics for a while, and not the ones that are complaining and making a key kind of intervention within those frameworks. So yes, I think there's a lot. This is much more structural than it is about a single person able to make a change.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a question wondering how many of the approaches to representing women's stories, he says, in tech and otherwise, have to address a perspective that's sort of about a relativity to men's stories, and is wondering whether there's a way to avoid that.
Yeah, avoiding the relativity to men's stories.
I think that's what the question is trying to get at.
I mean, one way to think of it is that this is about sort of intervening in patriarchy, not about not telling men's stories, because it's not a binary relationship between men and women. This is about any minoritized person, whether they be sort of a gender minority or racial minority, all the kinds of divisions that get sort of bifurcated as to how tend to organize themselves as reproducing the problem. But I think more importantly is really the idea that it isn't, again, this kind of framework of inclusion or exclusion that we need to worry about as much as the ways in which you do engage with each of this, when it comes to people and positions of power, engage with those individuals and their work, right? Does it mean that Jeffrey Ullman should never be spoken to or that his work should never be engaged? Perhaps not. Perhaps it's not about the silencing of his agenda, but about grappling with it and addressing what harm it does in the world, what violence his ideas have kind of produced. That is
sure. Yeah, thank you. The one I've been curious about is you showed the D-School, how you call it, path, and obviously this notion of speculative design is taking, its launching point is different. And I'm curious for, students who have approached me and others about how to transition from a point of view that's very influenced by sort of human-centered design, D-school thinking, and so on, into a world where they want to do work like the kind of work that you're doing. Which of the aspects of the training that they might get at a place like the D-school here at Stanford can they hold on to, and which elements of it do essentially we have to retrain our brains around?
Yeah, I mean, the ultimate question is what they're hoping to achieve, right? Are they hoping to generate new questions? Are they hoping to organize their work around issues and have a kind of stake in those issues and affect communities that they're working with? Or are they hoping to build a product that sells on the market? Those are very different goals. I'm not saying that all D-school issues are about products, but I think much of the product development cycle is organized in a way that sort of prioritizes the economic needs or prioritizes the capacity for these to churn a profit, as opposed to potentially listening to the concerns of folks that are very vocal about what they desire or want and need, and organizing a product that would fit those particular issues. And that I think the speculative piece is particularly around what is possible or impossible within those frameworks. So really questioning, reading, and producing new frameworks for addressing those needs and desires and underserved kind of capacities for computation to work in the world. So I think there's a lot that speculation does in its current form, but it's not some sort of package deal where it's sort of, I guess, as it's practiced in HCI, can very much be also just speaking to a very small group of people that are publishing together and writing together and not affecting the world outside it. So I'd say that connection with the world is the most vital part, whether you take up a human-centered design process or a speculative design process, how you kind of engage with those affected by the work you do.
Right. Yeah, and definitely human-centered does not have to be in contention with being speculative.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump to a question from an undergraduate, I believe, and then maybe one of the PhD students. I'd love to give a chance for one of the PhD students to jump in. So if any of you have thoughts, it will be a good moment. Asking a very practical question: how you recommend that individual college students can make an impact for the cause. So from the perspective that of the kind of work that you're doing, what would be the steps you'd recommend for them? So
Stanford students in general, or
sure, yep. Pick your persona.
Anyone. Yeah. Sure. Okay. Yeah. No. I mean, it's a great question because anyone can take up design methods in different ways, right? If they so choose, in the sense that you have the time and ability to do so. And what I think a student perspective offers in many ways is the ability to look outside the constraints of your faculty that might be responding to pressures for tenure, pressures for recognition, especially at places like Stanford junior faculty might need to conform to certain kinds of questions that they're asking. And in fact, what you can bring is attention to what is at stake in each of these projects. Why does this intellectual work matter? How can you, professor, or I guess I'm focusing this very much in the research direction, but I think it can be true outside it as well. The kinds of ways that your internships and industry or your engagements with people that you meet outside of your coursework. Everyone has a stake in technology development, and what is that stake, right? How can you learn and better inform yourself as you make your way through your curriculum? And each of those relationships, I think, proves vital to the kinds of impacts you make.
Thank you. I endorse that answer.
Yeah, I had a question. Thanks so much for your talk. I really enjoyed listening, and the projects are fascinating. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how you discover those metaphors. For example, the metaphor of craft was so powerful, the way that shifts the way you think about the process. And I'm curious to know how you arrive at those metaphors. Is it something you start with, or something you discover in the process as you're learning more and archiving more?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, we're always using metaphors in how we kind of encounter technology and our even just various aspects of our research. We're probably always using these shorthand ways of thinking about things. And for me, that has come very much out of the kinds of activities that I have found challenge my relationship to computing. So textiles has been a long-standing, craft and textiles kind of metaphors have been a long-standing focus of the work I've done. But they keep reappearing in interesting ways, in ways I don't expect. So for example, I have a project in a class that I'm teaching that's called On the Bias, and it's very much about the ways in which we experience systemic harms through and with the technologies that we produce but as a sort of encounter with the way you cut on the bias if you're a textile producer. So we're thinking about the bias itself as also a skew as it's sort of articulated in textile, the textile metaphor of bias being one which you turn fabric and it creates a sort of a powerful soft drape. You can create a headscarf, you can produce a cloth diaper, you can do particular things with bias in the textile world. And that is an example again of another metaphor that for me it keeps coming back as a generative space to think with as we imagine that the reorientation of a concept like bias can actually allow us to see also the generative aspects of attending to difference. Affirmative action, right, is a form of specific form of aggressive using bias for reparations. So I think there's a lot of ways in which metaphors kind of come about naturally, in quotes, through this everyday encounters with our environment and sort of looking at what they open up and what they sort of foreclose for the kind of analytic work you're doing.
So I guess as we're coming up on 11 o'clock at a Friday night for Daniela, why don't we all thank her for joining us and for very cool work. And we hope to see you back in the Bay Area at some point. We would love to meet you in person. Until then, we will make ourselves satisfied with what we got on Zoom. So thanks again so much for joining us and for giving us a late night talk.
No, thank you so much for having me and for all the questions. I really appreciate it.